the people, it's the people we don't see, the people whose names we don't know,
Indeed.
that actually make the biggest impact in our day-to-day lives.
I would argue that that's the case. There's like a lot of people who just a lot too many unsung heroes to count.
And so we spend so much time focused on these figureheads that really aren't, affecting change in our day-to-day lives, and we need to figure out how to take some of that power back.
Yeah. So
So I'm here with New York State Senator Gustavo Rivera. And I do want to acknowledge your loss today in this interview. The senator has lost a member, an integral member of his team. And so many of us have had significant losses this year, friends, family, colleagues, and there are so many changes that need to come from this, and so many lessons that we need to learn, and so many more acknowledgments that need to be made. And I would like to leave space for you to do that if you want to at any point. But the reason I asked for us to come together is because we just had this election.
yes,
And
we did.
so many people are celebrating the win
For the 67th time at this point, because
Yeah.
that orange pile of feces in the White House does not want to acknowledge what has been clear for a while, that he lost.
Yes.
And he did. And he absolutely lost. His supporters, or at least a chunk of his supporters, will never accept it. He will never accept it, but he lost.
Yes. But what I want to say for myself, and I can't speak for others, but for myself, Trump lost, but I didn't win anything. It doesn't feel like a win for me. It never did. From the time the ticket was announced, I felt profound grief and sadness, and actually went through like a little depressive phase just for a minute before I remembered that I'm registered green. I've been registered green since I could register to vote. I've very quickly switched over when, there was a chance, when it looked like Bernie could possibly be the guy, not this election, last one.
Yep.
And then I remembered that two-party politics and the political system was not designed for people like me. It was not designed for people who think the way I do, for people with my background, and that there's so many of us that are disenfranchised for one reason or another. And you are not, while you are entrenched in politics and while you are a part of the current political system, you're also a person who is very much in the grassroots movement, who works in your own community, hands-on, in order to affect change, to make things actually happen. And it's one of those things, like even the state senators, most of us don't really know who our state senators are.
If I may, but I want to go back for a second. I think it is important. It is important to recognize, as you said, related to this election, you were not the only one that was disappointed when ultimately the ticket came together, and there's a lot to say about what structures led to that. I think that what has been said by other folks that are, far more revolutionary than I will ever be in my life, is that it was important to vote for Biden to be able to have a fighting chance, but still have the recognition. And I have the recognition as I'm a member of a New York State legislature. I'm a member of the Democratic Party. So I could be considered, as you said, I could be considered entrenched in it, but there's a recognition that I have and that I try to communicate as much as possible to all of my colleagues and to people in this incoming administration, that we cannot ignore that we have to respond in a real way to the issues that impact real people, and that we cannot possibly go back to normal when we have this new administration. It was the normal that we lived for a very long time, which actually created the conditions that made a Trump possible. And what we can now possibly do is to not really, in a very deep and fundamental way, seek to change the things that have made these conditions possible. Because the problem is that you had as utterly evil as Trump and the administration around him have been, they were an incompetent administration. So I would like to, and this is something that I try to get to some of the folks in the administration, some in the incoming administration, and some of them have been more open than others, but you have to recognize that you had utter evil that was incompetent. What you do not want is to open up the possibility for a competent Trump. Imagine a competent Trump, somebody that was not as megalomaniacal, somebody who was not as short-sighted, somebody who has actually recognized what governing is and knows how to actually do it. That is the real concern. And the way that we get there is by not moving boldly to address the concerns that created these insecurities in so many millions of people across the country. We need to do that. We need to do that at the state level. We need to do that at the city level. We need to do that at the national level. And I know that I am certainly, even as a Democrat, I recognize that we have a lot of work to do, and it needs to be around changing fundamentally these systems that have failed us for so damn long.
So one of those systems is the Electoral College.
Yes. Shall we tell your listeners about this craziness? Or I'm sure.
Yes, and that's why I brought you in, because I feel like you could explain it in a way that I certainly could not.
Well, I will start by saying I think it's, pardon my French, bullshit. It is not. So the Electoral College was one of the many mechanisms that were built into the original design of the country. As good as the basic idea and fundamental notion of liberty and freedom are of this country, the reality is that the people who put those ideas together were white landowning males, most of them slaveholders. So, and most of them who had a very clear notion that they wanted a system that was responsive, but not too responsive, that was democratic, but not too democratic. And there's all sorts of mechanisms that were built into the system to make sure that that was the case. One of them was the Electoral College. The idea that ultimately it is not the direct votes of individuals that determine who the president will be, but instead at each state level, there is the popular vote, meaning how many people vote in a particular state. Whomever wins the majority, then this particular state based on its population, much like members of Congress, right? Because the bigger a state is in population, the more members of Congress it has. So in a very similar way, the number of electors, so those are the electoral votes. If you saw those maps across the country with red and blue dot, and that CNN and MSNBC and everybody else showed, they were talking about the electoral vote count, because each one of these states has a number of electoral votes, or that will ultimately represented by electors or people, but individual people who then would vote to actually make the president. And this just, we are recording this on December 16th of 2020. And it was only just a couple of days ago where officially this process happened in state legislative bodies in state legislative houses all across the country, including in New York. So electors, individuals who have been named electors, then go and actually cast their ballots in paper, and those are counted. And we already know what the outcome is going to be, and then they're certified. And so this system it's an elaborate way of saying, excuse me, that it is all about not respecting the popular vote.
Yes.
So it does not necessarily correspond to how many people actually voted for you. In 2016, more people voted for Hillary Clinton than did for Trump. However, because of the Electoral College, Trump was able to win the presidency, and Hillary Clinton was not. In this instance, we not only had Joe Biden not only won the popular vote, technically by a lot, more than any other presidential candidate in history, but he also won the electoral votes, the Electoral College. So he's been certified, even though we're going to have to physically drag the orange thing from the White House. I think that might actually have to physically happen. On January 20th, Joe Biden will be inaugurated, the next president of the United States. But the Electoral College is bullshit. That's the short version.
Okay. So I was reading somewhere that a voter in Wyoming has 4 times the electoral power of a voter from California.
Yep. You consider this. So I am a state senator in the Bronx, in New York State, New York City, and I represent about 318,000 people. And the Bronx has about 1.4 million people. Now, because I'm sitting in my computer, I am going to go to the intertubes.
Wyoming versus California, yes.
Yep. Let's go to Wyoming for a second. And Wyoming population 2020, the intertubes. There you go. Guess what the population of Wyoming is?
2 million?
I'm going to give you one more guess. Only because I'm looking at the intertubes. I'm cheating, but I'm going to give you one more guess. Go ahead.
I'm going to guess, if I'm wrong, that I'm going too high. It's like the Price is Right. 1.5 million.
I will give you a hint.
Okay.
If Wyoming was the Bronx, no, that's not a good hint. It's 580,000 people.
Oh my gosh.
Wyoming as a state, and I'm looking at the Googles at the intertubes, so it's probably so I'm gonna guess it.
Yeah.
But 578,759 to be exact. I'm gonna bump it up to say 280K. 580,000 people. I by myself represent 318,000 people. And the Bronx, which is one of 5 boroughs or 5 counties in the city of New York, not even the state, has 1.4 million people. So the borough that I live in and that I love and that I rep hard, I'm throwing up my X because I have to, has almost 3 times as many people as the state of Wyoming. And yet, Wyoming, again, these mechanisms, when the Constitution was written, the mechanisms that were created were about sometimes kind of creating a democratic system, but kind of like slowing down democratic impulses. And then also there was an issue about small states versus big states. And so the system that was created said that regardless of the size of the state, each state would get 2 US senators, while the representation of the House of Representatives would have to do with the population. So in this case, Wyoming, I'm sure, has 3 representatives in Congress, 2 US senators and one House of Representatives seat. So, but as far as and that one gives it a certain number of electoral votes, which the number that you quoted between California and Wyoming will give you a sense, because it's not weighted. It's not weighted, and it just means that small states like this, because you see the map of the country during all these things. You got the Electoral College votes and the electoral map, and you see this whole swath of red in the middle of this country. Well, some people live there, but not a lot of people live there.
Yeah.
So it's like land does not vote. people do. But the way the system is designed, it kind of gives them a certain advantage that they shouldn't have. We should change that system.
And I believe involved in that was also the 3/5 compromise.
That is correct. The one that established that, because slave owning states in the South who were part of the initial 13 colonies, which then became the original United States, they were like, well, we got a lot of people living down here. We got to have, like, they got to count for something. So we're gonna count them as 3/5 of a person as it relates to population. But just furthering this idea that was accepted as fact by almost everybody in that damn room that signed the document, that people could be property. So that's what our country was founded on. Yes. So this is, so it's one of those, I teach college and I teach political science, and there are certain things about the documents and about the ideas that drove them, and about the in broad strokes, the kind of what they set up, which we were the first representative democracy in any way. We were the first ones who designed what is known as federal system. So you had the national government and the state governments, and there was a interaction between them. There was so much that was unique, and has consistently over history kind of expanded, sometimes retracted, but many times expanded who gets to be included in this. So there are things about that document and about the idea of America that are still awe-inspiring to me. But you can actually, in the same sentence and in the same head, hold the fact that yes, these ideas were there, but this was written by white slave-owning men.
Yes.
And that they kind of made sure that the system that they put together was beneficial for them, and that it has been slowly, and sometimes not so surely, many of us kind of pulling away at it, at the threads of it, and saying like, no, we need to make it more expansive. We need to let women in. We need to let people of color in. We need to get younger people in. That's constantly what we're trying to pull.
So you have me thinking about reframing some thought processes, because as a New Yorker, yes, when I registered green, I did so with the knowledge that I lived in a city that voted Democratic, mm-hmm, and that I felt that I was doing my part to maintain democracy by at least ensuring that third parties do get their little 100,000 votes that they need to stay on the ballot.
A little bit more now, but yes. A little bit more.
Yeah. With the knowledge that it was almost impossible for New York City and therefore New York State, because once we talk about it again, New York is mostly red. And those of us from New York, the rest of the state, as you go north.
As far as geography, but remember, Miss Maitland, we just talked about this.
Yeah.
Land, don't vote.
Exactly. But that's what I'm saying. So once you leave the city, the politics change quickly and it turns very much into a red state. But because there's so much population density in New York City and that votes blue, mm-hmm, I've always been able to fall back on the knowledge that, okay, my state is going to go Democratic. I can make this symbolic vote for the fact that I believe that more than two parties should exist in this system.
If I may, and one of the things that I'd like to educate your viewers on, so the state of New York, because you mentioned something about third parties, et cetera, so they need to understand, some folks might already, but the state of New York has what is known as a fusion system, which is different. Not a lot of states have this. And what it does is you do have the big parties, if you will, the Democratic and the Republican, but because of the way that the structure of the electoral, how the elections are organized, you can actually have third, fourth, and fifth parties. Like there's parties like the Green Party that you mentioned. You have the Working Families Party, the Conservative Party, the Independence Party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of different party organizations. And the way that it works is that, for example, in my case, in the general election, now I'm a registered Democrat. And so I was on the ballot as a Democrat, but I also had my name underneath the Working Families Party line. And what I was telling people is like, listen, if you vote for me under the Democratic line, that gives me one vote. But if you vote for me under the Working Families Party line, that also gives me one vote, but gives them one vote. And the important part about this is that the Working Families Party, as an example, and everyone who is watching this should immediately go and Google Working Families Party. I'm not sure if they exist in your state yet, but if they do, you should become a part of them and you should work with them. They have been, essential in pushing the Democratic Party to the left for a very long time on issues of taxation, on issues of criminal justice, on issues of housing. They have been consistent in pushing pushing, prodding, kneeling in the groin sometimes, sweeping the legs sometimes, but to make sure that the Democratic Party actually corresponds, that what we do actually goes along the values that some of us hold to help working families. That's why they're called the Working Families Party. So in a place like New York, voting for the Working Families Party is not necessarily as you put it, an ornamental thing. The word that you used was
symbolic, I believe.
Symbolic, right? So in the case in the case of the Working Families Party, is one of the reasons I work closely with them, and I'm a big believer in the work that they do, is that they actually put their money where their mouth is, and it's more than symbolic. It is a demonstration of the values that voters want us to have as Democrats. They're saying like, yo, you need to do these things for us. You need to fight to have true affordable housing. You need to fight to tax millionaires and billionaires at a higher rate. You need to fight for healthcare for everybody. You need to do these things. Just so you know, we vote for them. We vote for you under that line, and we look for your name on that line to see if you stand with the values that we believe in. And the voters in New York have been able have said that. And in this year, because this year is a burning trash heap of but there's a couple of things about it that are positive. One of them in the state of New York was that we had more votes on the Working Families Party line than ever in the history of their existence. So they've actually become an even more important party. And they helped us, the Democratic Conference that I sit in, to walk into January with a super majority for the first time ever, which, just in a nutshell, means that we can actually potentially overturn vetoes that the governor pushes forward, which means that we can actually go toe to toe with him on a lot more issues that he has not been good on. And he's not been good on a lot of issues.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people fell in love with Cuomo this year with his press conferences. I was not one of them.
You're smart. Everybody just listen. Cuomo's not your boyfriend.
No, he's not. He's not your uncle.
You don't want Cuomo to be your boyfriend.
He's not your cousin that you're gonna call to get your back when you're getting jumped. He's not that. No.
He's none of those things. Now he gives really good face. And in comparison to the horrors that were happening at the national level and the complete lack of direction, not only real leadership, but even symbolic leadership, the national part, they failed completely. Cuomo stepped into that breach, and as he knows how to do, give the best face, and gave the impression that he was on it. Gave such a good performance. They gave him an Emmy. I'm not even joking.
I know he got an Emmy, and that in of itself was obscene. Like, how do you give an Emmy for health briefings? But that's another story. But I remember the early days when he was like, "Oh, I had no idea," and they gave me all this wrong information, and I'm sitting at home thinking, I'm a healthcare worker, but I'm not an active healthcare worker. I'm sure the information that I have, which is trickling through several sources, is not as complete as what the governor of the state is receiving in briefings. So how is it that my husband, who works as a chef in a restaurant, was more alarmed about this, like from February, saying, "Oh, we're going to need to go buy masks," than the governor of New York? How is it that when Trump recalled everyone from Europe And we're sitting at home going, oh, wow, this is a terrible idea. All these people are going to come through New York. And when they're showing these people sitting at customs, shoulder deep, thousands of people streaming into New York with no kind of separation, no screening. And I remember SARS back in the day. I used to travel because I was in school in Cuba back then. And we used to, they had us separated. We had temperature screenings. We had forms we had to fill out. And I'm like, we did that for SARS back in the day. How is it that we have hundreds of thousands of people filtering in through New York and nothing, no screening, no separation, no isolation? And I'm like, this is a terrible idea. So when a week and a half later, we were inundated with cases, I certainly was not surprised. I don't know how the governor was surprised, but I was not.
So one of the things that I did, I'm very big in visual. I'm a very visual person, and I like physical things. I'm old school that way. I like physical things, right? So one of the things in my capacity as senator that I did just a couple of months ago was that I chaired right from here. I chaired over 30 hours of hearings on the impact of COVID-19 on nursing homes and hospitals. And one of the things that I did to kind of get straight in my head what was happening was that I went out and got a physical calendar to put some of these dates down to be able to tell myself, like, wait a minute, when did this happen? When did this happen? When did this happen? And you're correct. I mean, the pause, just to give you one number, which the one that I just blew my mind when I started to put it all down, on March 19th, which was a Thursday, that's when California locked down.
I remember they gave them 2 hours.
At that point, California, which is a bigger state, both geographically and demographically than the state of New York, had just over 1,000 cases, 1,005 cases, and they locked down. So that day, New York had over 5,700 cases. And I'll remind you, I'll remind your viewers, right? This is at the beginning of March or the middle of March, when testing capacity was still not up to speed, when we still did not have the penetration as far as the testing. So we didn't have the rapid testing, like all of these. So every test was lagging, right? Because the incubation period, which was still we were still figuring out whether it was 3 days, whether it was 4 days, 7 days, et cetera. So at that point, we already had 5,700 cases, and New York took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days to close until after that to be able to shut down, to do the New York pause. And also the conversation about this shutdown of New York, now at the beginning of that week of March, so March 16th, that week, the mayor of the city of New York had said that he wanted to do a curfew. He said a phrase, I don't remember which one it was, but the governor was like, no. First of all, he doesn't have the authority to do that. Second, I don't like that name. I don't like to tell people that we're going to do that. So it took him a few more days to come up with the right terminology. And then when he came up with New York pause, then he's like, I'm going to do it now. But it was late by then. It was late.
Also, from an epidemiologic standpoint, in California, they gave them a few hours to get ready. They said, we're going to lock down today. You have to this time this afternoon. In New York, we gave people several days advance notice, which allowed all of our rich people to flee the city, taking the virus with them. So,
bottom line is that there's because we could talk about Cuomo for a while.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that everybody understands that he does not deserve all the accolades that he is getting, and he is denying accountability for for mistakes that he made then, which he is making again, when he's not moving with enough speed, regardless of the information that he does have at his disposal. And it's unfortunate because it will cost lives, and it already has. And I don't believe that he's been held accountable in the way that he needs to be. And we're in the process of doing that. There's pieces of legislation that were a product of those series of hearings, but we still don't have clear information from the governor's office or for the administration on a lot of different measures. And we're going to continue pushing. And I'm hopeful that a new supermajority that starts in January, with me continuing to lead the health committee then, we'll be able to get some of these answers from them.
So you just touched on the reason why we really came together, which is accountability. Yeah. There are so many people, like I said, who either don't feel like their vote is counting, don't feel like the issues are on the ballot that they need to be voting for, which is another story about how our system works, or simply cannot vote for whatever reason. How do we as citizens, and when I say citizens, I like to use it in the same way that you do, that doesn't mean someone who is legally a citizen, but simply a person who lives here and is participating. Yep. How do we hold our elected officials accountable? And how do we make changes that are substantive for ourselves? Because it seems like we have to support ourselves through this.
So there is, so a couple of things here. First, you are correct that when I use citizen, it is not, I don't use it strictly to speak about the legal status of somebody who is legally a citizen, quote unquote. But for me, from a political science perspective, it refers to the relationship that an individual has with state or government and the relationship that government has with them. So that the responsibilities and the obligations that flow from one to the other, and how we need to actually, be active in our citizenship. And so you are correct that, and this goes back to what we were talking about a little earlier, the system was built with certain mechanisms to actually avert democratic accountability. And we have had to force that open, right? There are elections, but elections are only after a couple of years. There are systems which have been built, which actually kind of close out the possibility of certain people running for office. So certain people kind of always run for office. The systems that are built that kind of make it hard for some people to participate. And we slowly but surely try to change those. I would say that the most important and most basic thing that we have to realize is that it is about organizing. It is about the number. It is about having numbers. The number of regardless of what you care about, if you care about environmental concerns, if you care about criminal justice, if you care about housing, if you care about healthcare, I can guarantee you there's 1 or 5 or 10 organizations who care deeply about that and are doing organizing on the subject. It would be my suggestion that you do some research to find out the organizations that are doing work on that already and add your voice and your body and your time and your effort to them. Now, I understand that it's not that you still have to put food on the table, that you still have to do things on a day-to-day basis. But the reality is, and it was Frederick Douglass that said this, power concedes nothing without demand. It never has, and it never will. And the demands that have to come from people, and this, I'm speaking as an elected official, but somebody who was an organizer before and who believes in being an organizer still. You can never assume that the person who is across from you, if you are sitting across the table from an elected official, whomever that person is, whether that person is your council member, your mayor, your president, your state senator, whomever, you can never assume that that person is a good person. They might be terrific human beings. They might prove to be. But in their capacity as a public servant, as an elected official, the response, what you have to organize yourself, you have to gird yourself to always make certain demands from the people who work for you, even if you like them. And the way that I say it is, if you come into the office of an elected official X, and you come into the office by yourself and you say, hey, Congress member X, I have this issue and I think it's important. I think you need to take a look at it. There's a couple of different things that might happen depending on who's on the other side of the table if you go by yourself. Scenario number 1, that person talks to you and then, you tell them you have this issue and they, you leave the office and they turn to their staff and they were like, we need to get right on this. This is important. Scenario number 2, same thing happens. You go in by yourself, talk about the situation that you want to resolve. And then they say, thank you so much. And you leave. Then they turn to their staff and said, I never want to see this person in here again. They do nothing but yappity, yap, yap, yap. I don't want to talk to them. Scenario number 3, same thing happens. You come in, describe your situation, you leave. They go like, this is important, but I got other stuff that I got to do. I'm going to put it down here and I'll get to it eventually. But if you show up to that same conversation with 10 people, with 100 people, with 1,000 people, regardless of who's on the other side of that table, they are going to pay attention because they have to. Now, some of us, and I would ask that, you know, that I be judged based on what I do, not what I'm saying right now, but I'm pretty certain that the last 10 years of my tenure have demonstrated that I actually give a shit about the people I represent, and I work for them every day. But for someone like myself, I'm like, I'm going to take what you have to say seriously. I'm going to see what I can do about trying to resolve it. But if you have somebody across this table from you who's a complete scumbag, who couldn't give two, you know, who couldn't give two shits about you or the community that you're from, if you show up in force, they'll be like, I have to pay attention. I have to, because these people can unelect me. These people can, if they're organized enough to come into here with 1,000 folks or representing 1,000 folks, they can unelect me. So I need to pay attention. So that's the bottom line. It is about numbers. It is about joining your voice and joining your time and joining your spirit to other folks who are doing the same thing. Because regardless of what you care about, there's people already organizing on it.
So do you feel like the petition is still a valid tool to use to access?
In a sense, I mean, but most petitions, that just means that certainly the folks who are in front of me certainly did a lot of work to go out and talk to whomever it is, you know, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 people to actually sign a piece of paper. And that's enough. But if that's something, I should say, that's something. But that just speaks to the ability of the 3 or 4 people in front of me who are organizers to actually go people and get that signature. That just gives me a sense like, okay, they were able to do that. Now, if you can give me a sense that you are, let's say you have 5,000 people that signed a petition, but that you have your contact information, that you're engaging them, that they in turn will communicate back to me and said, hey, I signed a petition because I believe in this and the other thing. What are you doing about that? If you give me a sense that it's not just that stack of papers with a lot of names on them, but that there is an organizing effort behind taking all of these names and all this information and being able to get them to pressure me in the future, like that will be a lot more effective. So petitions are like, there's something, but the difference is, are you actually organized? Are you actually organizing? That's what makes the difference, really.
And so one of the things I know is that a lot of people feel frankly afraid to be seen, to be truly seen within the political system, that, you know, they don't want to draw attention to themselves for various reasons. Are there any protections for people who are engaging politically?
Explain the question a little bit more.
Well, I mean, especially in New York, we have such a large undocumented population.
Yes.
With things like the stimulus checks that came out, undocumented people were not included.
That's correct.
Anyone who does not have a social security number, let's put it that way, not just undocumented people, but if you were here on a student visa, were not included. If you were married to someone and submitted joint tax returns, the US citizen spouse also was not included.
Right.
And so I believe the number that was quoted by like MSNBC was something like 11 million US citizen spouses did not receive stimulus because they were married to someone with an ITIN number. That's it, because the ITIN does not tell you a person's status and the IRS does not really know your status in that way. And so I feel like a lot of people who were in that situation were afraid to speak up because they are afraid of the repercussions that could happen on the spouse. And there are, of course, a lot of people who are simply whole family units where people are undocumented, or the children are citizens and the parents are not. And so people really are afraid to engage because they feel like if they draw attention to themselves, especially with the current political climate, you know, people are afraid of deportations and other issues.
Indeed. So I think that there are organizations that actually work with undocumented folks and advocate on their behalf. Some of these folks are gutsy, I've been in, I take my hat off to them. As somebody I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico is not a foreign country.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to travel here, I just got on a plane and I just got up here. So my immigration story is nowhere near as complicated as many of the other folks who I represent. So there is when somebody says, and I've heard them say it many times, that they're undocumented and unafraid, I take my hat off. There's a level of courage there that is big. A lot of people, however, they don't want to do that. They don't want to put themselves at risk, which I understand and respect. There are organizations that want to that do advocate on their behalf. There's just here in New York, Make the Road New York is a very important organization in that regard, and they've done a bunch of work around the country. But the original chapter is here, Make the Road, and you basically every organization that I work with on different issues around healthcare, around criminal justice, there's representation from folks who are undocumented, and we always remember. I try to always remember that that's the case, that we have to, that I work for them too. And when I interact with them individually, I also tell them that. I was like, whether you're undocumented or not, if you live in my district, I work for you. So, but you are correct. There is a sometimes lack of protection for those individuals. And I'd like to think that the first and most important thing that we did is we got rid of Trump. There is now, while I recognize that the front lines in immigration enforcement is very separate from where the president is, right? So the president determines something and it rolls down, and sometimes it doesn't quite get to the people in the front lines, or they just ignore it. So there is going to be a lot of effort that we need to do to make sure that I think we should get rid of ICE personally, right? So I think we should there's certain aspects of policing the immigration, the immigrant population in the state, in the country, that we should eliminate, that we should phase out, because that fear exists and it's a real one, and we need to do so much better for our immigrant population. So I'm certainly committed to do that in the state.
Okay, so what do you think will happen now that Trump is out, Biden is in? Do you think that any changes will happen?
They need to, and we can't hope for it. We have to work for it. We have to demand. It's one of the things that we're starting to do right now. I actually think that it is a good thing that organizations and individuals at different levels are telling the administration in very clear words, you need to do more than just status quo. Like, you need to be bold. You need to be bold around economic opportunity. You need to be bold around taxation. You need to be bold around criminal justice. You need to be bold around immigration. You need to be bold on all of these things. Because as we said earlier in the conversation, if we don't do that, if we don't resolve what our basic issues to, like, because the reality is there's people who voted for Obama twice and then voted for Trump, which blows my mind, but is a thing. And people who were big Bernie people who then voted for Trump. There is reality that there is a disconnect between between the actual lived experience of so many Americans and actual progress. And we need to focus on that. We can't just focus we can't just do the same things that we've done before. We can't just go around the margins. We have to go at the center of the problem. And I mean, one issue in particular that I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to is healthcare. Here in the state of New York, as the chair of the health committee and main sponsor of a piece of legislation called the New York Health Act, which is an attempt to bring a single payer system to the state of New York, thereby guaranteeing healthcare to every single New Yorker. I believe that we need to do that at the national level. Now, he's saying that he's not going to do that, and I think we have to push him to do it. And as I stated earlier, I don't, in the same way that I don't want anybody who is in my district to assume that I'm a good person. I mean, certainly I'd like to think that I am, and I can demonstrate it, but whether I am or not, I want them to demand more from me. In the same way, the president, I'm his constituent. We're talking about Biden. We're not talking about the other guy. I have never called by that title, and I never will call by that title. I will call him former anything. I would say he's still a piece of garbage. He was a piece of garbage before, and he's a piece of garbage now. He just lived in a different address. That was the only difference. But the point is, the president, I'm part of his constituency, and I'm going to demand more from him. And I have the ability, by the way, because of my position, to do so in a louder way, in a way that I know will get to his people. And I'm going to use that on behalf of the people who I work for. Because the folks in the Bronx who've been ignored, people of color and poor and working class communities all across the country who have been ignored, the policies that we're pushing are not actually about trying to resolve their issues. Those are the folks that we need to make sure that we take care of. And by doing that, if we're talking about poor and working class folks, we'll take care of white people too, because they're working class folks as well. But we can't ignore the racist components of so many of our systems. Like, we have to do all of these things at once. So, but we can only respond to these things by going bold. And so I will push to make that happen. So I don't think that it can happen. I believe it needs to, and I'm going to do what I can to make sure that it does.
So I have to sort some things out. When I came of age and registered to vote, one of the reasons why I chose not to become a Democrat, like every other member of my family, and I am not the only member of my generation in my family that chose to register third party, was because of, in the 90s, the number of, I would say, under the radar legislative issues that were passed, especially by the Clinton administration, that were detrimental to communities that looked like mine. Since we're talking about undocumented people, one of the things that was passed was the fact that there was no longer a path to citizenship when you married a US citizen. And then, of course, there's the crime bill that, has kept coming up over and over and over again.
As it should.
And one of the things is you could feel the effects in school when you were in middle and high school of those policy changes, when they started to bring police officers into the schools, when people, instead of getting like in-school suspension for truancy, started to be arrested for truancy. And so we started to feel that pressure as children. And so when I turned 18, I was like, I can't vote for this party that is directly negatively impacted so much of my life. So
that's very fair, very fair.
What can you say for people who might feel like me? Because I feel like there are so many people who have just decided to drop out of politics, that they don't want to, they say, it's just not a part of anything. But these things do have an impact on our life. And I know that, you have a busy schedule, we need to go. Are there any final words you can say? And I'm really looking for some inspiration, because like we said in the beginning, these are hard times and people are down and we're just like feeling it in our souls, like maybe we should give up. What can you say just to bring us back?
That we shouldn't, because we can't. If we can, as I can certainly speak from a place where I recognize that my story, my personal story, is not one about struggle. It's about privilege. And there's a lot of privileges that I have by being male, by being cisgendered, by being light-skinned, by being white passing, by being bilingual, by being educated, by being a senator. All of those things just mean that I have more of a responsibility to make sure that many of the folks who I work for, who I live amongst, right? Because this is my neighborhood, that I fight on their behalf. So every one of us has a level of privilege that other folks don't have, and we need to be cognizant of that. That's number one. But also what I would say is that at the core of it, I think that if we define politics, there's a guy by the name of Harold Laswell, It's a political scientist in the 1930s who defines politics as who gets what, when, and how. So it's a recognition that the process of politics is about limited resources and who has the access to the levers of power to determine that they go here or they go there, et cetera. So that means that that process is going to happen whether you're involved or not, whether you like it or not, whether you know who your state electeds are. It's happening every single day. So I would suggest that you have to care and that you should focus on the local. Because one of the things is that I can understand how people feel, particularly when we talked about this nonsense of the electoral college earlier, which there are efforts to change, which I'm a part of, and I certainly want to change that entire crappy system. But that it is easy for you to be like, well, I can't ever focus on, like, I can't ever have an impact really on what happens at the presidential level. And to an extent, depending on the state that you're in, you might be right. But at the local level, that's an argument that you can never make, particularly since the folks who get elected at the very, very local level usually get elected by a couple of thousand votes. Remember that when I told you earlier? What's that?
The Queens runoff.
As an example, the Queens district attorney, talking about the Queens district attorney, the Queens district attorney race last year was determined by a couple of dozen votes. My district, I represent 318,000 people. In 2010, when I was first elected, it had about 310,000. Of that, about 270,000 were over 18. Of that, 160,000 were 18 and citizens. And of those, about 140,000, I think, were registered as Democrats. So in the race that I won, that made me be able to represent 318,000 people for the last 10 years. Do you know how many people voted total?
No idea.
Less than 10,000.
Wow.
Less than 10,000. And so regardless of what you're talking about, and the thing is, by the way, the things that I have an ability to have an impact on with whatever state, whatever you live, your state legislator or local legislator has the ability to have impact on a whole bunch of things that get determined at the state, at the city, at the local municipal level. They have an influence on that. And you can actually elect them and unelect them because there's so few people who participate. So so I would tell you the first that I would say, again, hope. For me, it's about the work. So you got to focus on the work. If we want a better situation for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, for our neighbors, we have to work. Ain't easy, but it's necessary. Focus on the fact that you have a little bit more privilege than somebody else. If you're a citizen, you have a level of privilege that no undocumented person has. If you're a white man, you have more privilege than probably most other people combined. But as I said, it's like, I'm a Latino dude, but I'm white passing, I'm bilingual, I'm educated. All these things I have to recognize. Yes, I worked hard for them, but they make me be in a position in which I can do something for people who are less privileged than me. So you do that, you think about that, there's a level of privilege that gives you an obligation to do something for somebody else. And then consider that at the local level, your impact can be magnified because of the few people who participate. And the organizing that you can do at the local level can definitely have that impact. So that's what I would tell you. Hoping that works.
It does. And so, in the opening to my show, there's a card that says, "Don't mourn, organize." And I think that that's basically what you're saying is we have to get organized. We have to instead of allowing those feelings of mistrust to bring us down, that we need to use it to empower ourselves. And as you said, we're both sitting here in very privileged positions. We're both bilingual, we're both educated. The fact that I even have access to someone like you puts me in a position of extreme privilege, which is why, I want to be able to ask you these questions. And it's so interesting getting even a glimpse into the inner workings of our government, because so many of us just don't really understand how it works. And that I feel like that ignorance is one of the main things that disenfranchises people.
You are correct.
as always, I want to thank you for your time.
Yes, my friend.
We're
It is very good. It's very good to see you. It's very good to see you.
And, you know, hopefully at some point I will be back in New York and I'll get to see you in person.
Post-Rona.
Post-Rona. Oh, of course, like 2022. Barbecue 2022.
First and second round are on me. How about that?
Okay. All right. And so, yes, don't mourn, organize. And as always, keep it moisturized.
Indeed.
Yes.
Have a good one, folks.
Bye.
That's your phrase?
Yeah.
Keep it moisturized?
I mean, you know, come on. El aceite de coco. Uh-huh. You see? Is life. I'm leaving this part in, you know that.
I was like, no, this is not a paid announcement or anything like that. Have a good one, my friend. Bye-bye.